And now back to our main topic this evening, peace talks on the war in Ukraine, which are taking center stage at the Munich Security Conference. Now, a short while ago, the meeting between U.S. Vice President Vance and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy ended. And for more on how that meeting unfolded, let's go back live to our correspondent, Aaron Damon, who is joined by Phil Dickinson from the Atlantic Council. Aaron, I give you the floor.
Thank you, Diana, and thank you, Phil, for joining us live here in Munich. Can I start with that meeting between Volodymyr Zelenskyy and Vance? How important do you think that meeting is in generating some sort of plan for peace in Ukraine?
It's really important. It's essential for the Ukrainians to build that relationship with the new administration. Obviously, this week has been a lot of news coming through about how the administration plans to approach negotiations with Ukraine. So making sure that Ukraine is involved from the start and that is closely coordinated with the Americans and that they understand the American approach and are clear about their red lines, that's really important. And so is building the personal relationship and rapport between President Zelenskyy and Vice President Vance, because they will be really important players throughout all of this process.
That speech by Vance today, in it he told leaders that he is not as worried about Russia and China as the risk of Europe losing its democratic values. What did you make of that?
I thought it was an interesting and I'll say unconventional speech for this kind of conference format and setting. Typically, traditionally, these speeches will focus on the specifics of defense policy, security policy. President von der Leyen's speech immediately beforehand was much more typical on what you would expect. And I think people came into Vice President Vance's speech looking for insights into exactly what we were just talking about, Ukraine and the future of Ukraine and that question. And instead, he came straight out the bat, as you said, to say that his biggest concern was freedom of speech in Europe, democratic conditions in Europe. I'm sure that would have taken a lot of people in the room a little bit by surprise. And I think it emphasizes a few things. One is that this administration, it was the kind of speech that you could see him giving domestically to a supportive domestic audience. And so that is their primary audience that they will always have in mind when they're speaking, even at international conferences where perhaps the customs and protocol are to be a bit more deferential to some of the domestic political concerns in Europe. That's not the way this administration is going to play things. They're always going to speak with their domestic audience and their priorities in mind. That was my main takeaway from that, and it will be interesting to see how European leaders digest that message and respond to it.
You're based in Washington. Is the transatlantic alliance, as we know it under President Trump, on life support?
No. I think there has been a lot of understandable kind of panic, a lot of strong reactions to a lot of the news that has come out, certainly over the last few days, and from the statements that have been said during the political campaign. We did go through something similar in the start of the second Trump administration, and it's part of the sort of way of doing business that Donald Trump has, is that keeps people off balance. He sees that as a strategy for maximizing American leverage so that he can drive home American interests as he see it on a bilateral basis. But ultimately, the record of the first Trump administration was that they committed to NATO, was that they supported Ukraine. And yes, there are some of the interpretations of what have been said this week lead some people to worry and feel anxious that the transatlantic relationship is going to be changing in some shape. I would say keep calm, carry on. The important message that Europe has to hear is that the United States expects Europe to stand up, to demonstrate real leadership, that if it considers the nature of Russian aggression as a systemic threat and as a kind of existential threat, then it needs to act as such. And I think that is a lot of the signaling that European leaders, they've taken that message on board. They're now going to have to figure out how they go about doing that.
Vance also told us, quote, "We can come to a reasonable settlement between Russia and Ukraine." I want to just linger on that word reasonable. Mm-hmm. Does Ukraine have reason to be worried about what a reasonable settlement looks like?
Well, I think the use of the word reasonable in the context of the speech today was to acknowledge the situation, but to largely move on to the topics that he was most interested in discussing. But the question that you ask, I think, brings us back to the initial question, which is the importance of President Zelenskyy being involved in the negotiations right from the outset, that he builds a good relationship with the Vice President, with President Trump and all of the administration who are going to be engaged on this. And that he also leans on the Europeans to come in and step forward where it seems that American support might be stepping back. Then it's incumbent on Europe to step forward and grasp the nettle. But in terms of reasonable negotiations, look, we're at the start of what is going to be a complicated process. I hope that nobody approaches this with any naivety and is open to the history that Vladimir Putin has with some of these topics and negotiations in Europe, approaches it with eyes wide open and is focused on making sure that there is sustainable peace in Ukraine, that the security guarantees that it needs have real teeth, and that Russia is deterred for the long term.
So how does Donald Trump picking up the phone, opening that line of communication, direct communication to Vladimir Putin, how does that change the game? Is that Trump's diplomatic muscle working at its best or at its worst?
I think it's part of his style. He has always thought of diplomatic relationships and statecraft as primarily an activity between the world leaders themselves on a personal one-to-one basis. He had built up a relationship with Vladimir Putin during the course of his first term, and he revealed that he had maintained conversation and some contact with him whilst he was out of office. So I think it just plays into his instincts, really. His instincts are to pick up the phone, even at short notice, to maybe unlock things, to break down doors. He is interested in working fast and decisively. It's a contrast to previous administrations where the interagency process can be very methodical and thought through. That's not Donald Trump's style. He is going to pick up the phone to people. It will take people off guard and surprise people. He did it to the UK Prime Minister just today. I saw that he called him with no notice, but nobody is looking at that and sort of panicking and thinking, what does this mean about the future of the transatlantic relationship? It's his style.
And lastly, Munich Security Conference, it's always been the centre of basically people saying we need to get serious about defence.
Yep.
Is this time different?
I hope so. I think 2022 was the first real wake-up call. And you have seen Europe step up to a certain degree over the last few years with the support it has provided to Ukraine. Where it needs to step up now is, first of all, maintaining that support, filling in any gaps where the United States may be pulling back, but doubling down on their own efforts at increasing defense investments domestically. Poland is an absolute model ally in terms of that, has one of the highest percentages of GDP spend on defense. I think a lot of European countries could look to Poland as an example. And President von der Leyen's speech at the start of the session earlier today set some very clear policy directions on the EU's part. And there's going to require a lot of cooperation between the EU, between member states, NATO, and NATO member states that are not in the EU.
Phil Dickinson, Deputy Director at the Atlantic Council, thank you again for your time.
Thank you very much.
And that's all from us live here at the Munich Security Conference for today. Back to you, Diana.
Thank you so much, Aaron Damon and Philip Dickinson from the Munich Security Conference. We will be coming back to you throughout the evening. And that completes this edition of World News Tonight here live from Warsaw. I'm Diana Skaya. Thanks for watching and have a good evening.